recording. So for this week's AI seminar, we're joined by Canaan Breiss. He's an assistant professor of linguistics here at USC. He received his PhD in linguistics from UCLA. And Professor Breiss researches theoretical, computational, experimental phonology using methods like computational statistical modeling, corpus methods, and behavioral experiments. Today he'll talk to us about his research on self-supervised speech models and how they represent phonological and morphological phenomena. We'll accept questions during the talk as well as at the end. And with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Breiss.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Cool. Like Eric said, this is redundant. I just wanted to to orient you guys towards what I'll be presenting today. So I'm a cognitive scientist interested in how speech sounds are learned and represented in humans. So this is what phonology means. I use tools and theories from computer science and cognitive science and linguistics to tackle maybe not all angles, but many angles of the first research question. I also love collaborating. This is collaborative work with John Gauthier from UCSF, as well as senior folks at UCSF. Gosh, this is awkward. I forgot their last names. Eddie Chang and Matt Leonard. So if any of this strikes a chord in you as something you would like to think about or talk about or have questions about, please feel free to reach out either now or later. Also, like Eric said, in terms of questions, linguistics at the best of times is kind of a jargon-heavy field. And so I want this to be as useful and accessible to people here as possible. So please raise your hand or jump out of your seat and give a shout if something is not clear what I mean. If you have questions about what is it that I'm doing, what is the big picture, what does it all mean, those are also very welcome, but I would hold those to the end. Cool. So this talk generally takes as a starting point the process of spoken word recognition. As a linguist and a cognitive scientist, I care about what are the kind of representations that are recruited online as part of this process. It's a hard task. You go from noisy acoustics to something that's actually quite abstract, invariant across speakers and contexts and other factors. We think that these representations might look like, some phonemes, for example, among other representations, and they mediate this translation process. In the pre-deep learning era, there have been a bunch of computational models that have been developed to implement what we think are the key or core characteristics of speech recognition or speech parsing. These include things like trace or shortlist or shortlist B, other models. They have explicit linguistic levels of representations. So if you take off the lid, you can see the phonemes or see the morphemes in them. And they actually do a really nice job at explaining small scale in the lab, experimentally designed word recognition processes. In recent years, however, there's been a massive engineering breakthrough, and then it's broken through and now it's doing cool stuff in spoken word recognition using self-supervised speech models. These are models that operate on raw audio and do word recognition dynamically in real time and in a naturalistic way. They don't have explicit linguistic representations. If you take off the hood, take off the lid, look under the hood, you just see more numbers. That's not necessarily a problem, but that's a unintuitive, at least, as a place to start. If you come from a position of cognitive science where the natural language is well modeled at a certain level of abstraction by discrete symbols. And they're not yet, at least, interpretable as a cognitive theory. And so today's talk will be starting to take a few steps towards using these models and representations and modifications on these kinds of deep learning models to try to understand how they do speech recognition and specifically word recognition, and how we can start to use those models with techniques from cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience to start to understand what relevant factors for understanding human speech recognition might be revealed to us by looking at these models. As an example, I want to give you guys just a kind of lightning overview of what one such self-supervised model is. Wave effect 2, have people heard of this? No, okay, so I guess raise your hand if you do speech stuff. Okay, cool. So great. No, that's very good. That helps me orient myself. So the basic architecture of wave effect 2 and other similar kind of self-supervised speech models is similar to the transformer architecture, or rather, it is a transformer architecture, and the training method is similar to kind of whatever you do for a text. The problem is we don't really have tokens in speech, and so you need to kind of define your self-supervised loss a little bit differently. The default, kind of the vanilla training of these things with self-supervised loss is this, what's called audio contrastive loss, where you kind of chunk up the input audio stream into 20 millisecond overlapping chunks, and then pass them through some CNN layers to get things down to the right size, and then into the 12 or 18 or 24 layer transformer blocks. And as you go through, the loss is designed so that you pull together representationally or acoustically similar representations. You pull together representations of items that are acoustically similar and push apart those that are acoustically different. Of course, what similar means evolves somewhat as you go deeper into the network and you get kind of more enriched representations. But it's not so different in the kind of general scheme from what you're used to with text-based models.
Here is an item, a 20 millisecond increment?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Or the the embedding of that 20 millisecond increment as passed through however many layers you might happen to be at that point.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess I should also raise, this is, because this is collaborative work, it's the best kind of collaborative work where no one person is the expert on all of it. So I'm obviously the linguist and cognitive scientist here, or linguist here at least, and I know some things about the technical details of this, enough to, I hope, be responsible for giving this talk. But I have my co-author, John Gauthier, who did a lot of the engineering stuff for this on the line also. So he can answer kind of the very, very deep questions, detailed questions you might have about this architecture that I might be not as familiar with. So heads up. That doesn't mean don't ask. That just means like hold till the end maybe. Cool. There's been some work on these models done already by myself and other people in the past. And we know that they encode some sort of basic phonological categories. Basic phonological categories like they recognize a b sound across contexts or across speakers. But we don't know what kind of, I guess you can decode classifier, or you could fit classifiers that nicely divide phonemes, which is to say kind of abstract representations of like all the buzz together, all the puts together, into, you can classify them based on the embeddings. So there is that information in there, but it's not clear how that information is actually being used to support either other functions of the model or like, lexical knowledge or other kinds of acoustic manipulation, or what we're interested in here today, word recognition. So the plan for today is to, we're going to take these kind of a base self-supervised speech model, particularly wave effect 2 we've been talking about. There are more current ones, but that's the one that we have our hands on and operated with at the time we were doing this, which was only relatively recently. And then we're going to derive from it a word recognition model. So this is, we're kind of going to bolt on top a specific, supervised loss that's optimizing for what we think humans are doing. And then we're going to compare the two. So, we're going to take this model and then kind of do the typical thing in computational cognitive science these days, which is to treat it as an experimental subject. So we're going to kind of give it the same kind of tasks that we think humans are doing when they recognize words. And then we're going to kind of use this information to do inference about what its internals are doing for us. This is just this is a little bit about the kind of new loss that we're bolting on top. We're taking the base wave-to-vec model, this pre-trained object with the acoustic level self-supervised loss we talked about before, and then we're adding to it a word contrastive loss. Now this is supervised. We basically take force-aligned audio with, continuous audio with chunks saying, here's where the person is saying the word chase, here's the word cats, here's the word and we're then treating the kind of all of the acoustic units in that span as like one object. I believe we take the mean pool over that span. And then we run the same, we run it through the model, but at the end we have a lexical contrastive loss where you pull together tokens of the same word. So if you said cat, and then in a different audio recording, someone else said cat, since we have this labeled, we're saying, okay, we can restructure your representation such that the two cat tokens are pulled together, and kind of corollarily, non-cat tokens are pushed apart. So it's a hinge loss. Yeah.
Is there a naive question?
Yeah.
What is the ultimate goal of this whole thing you're doing?
That's a very big question. The ultimate goal is to try to use self-supervised speech models as kind of in silico proxies for how humans do speech recognition. And then
what are the applications? So
applications? None, or at least none obvious. I do basic science.
okay.
Sorry, that's not, maybe John has better ideas about applications. Ultimately, we want to go to the brain with this. So looking at how people try applying these same kind of analysis techniques to brain data. John works in, and the other co-authors here run an ECOG lab. So where you actually place kind of grids of electrodes on the brain. I'm sure there could be downstream applications of this, and I'd be happy to discuss with people about that. But yeah,
Okay.
that I wasn't intending to be flippant. Just I don't think about those kind of things, which is an incredible luxury. So sorry. If you have ideas, we'd love to talk about it. Other questions at this stage? Cool. Okay. So we now kind of, with this model, we compute an embedding for every word in a test set. This is kind of getting on the table how we're going to get the data that we'll be working with for the rest of the talk. So if this seems like a lot of throat clearing, it is just trying to sort of put in place all the things we're working with for the rest of the talk. So we train this, of course, in a cross-validated way where we don't leak information from the training set about the alignments. We get the embeddings of all of the words from a relevant data set, and we put those aside. And those were kind of things we're operating with for the rest of the talk. We also do the same thing for the wave-to-vec model. So we kind of take off the word contrastive loss, still looking at the supervised, kind of the boundary aligned audio, and say, okay, how did the unfine-tuned model represent this? And so now we have matched set of embeddings for the word contrastive, kind of fine-tuned, so to speak, model, and then one for the base model. It's worth noting that my co-author, John, has done a lot of really, really cool work that is not here, that actually shows that the word contrastive model does exhibit kind of the right psycholinguistic properties that we think people do when they do speech word recognition, and incremental processing, and matching up well to neural data, that kind of thing. So there is a reason to think that this is not just, this has validity as a model of word recognition beyond just, I'm saying it is in this talk. Yeah.
Quick question. I know this is like prior work, but
Totally.
with this wave-to-vec model, it sounded like it's cross-speaker. But can you comment on how much within speaker variation versus across speaker variation it captures? Because I could imagine that with like an accent or something, there might be more self-similarity than like phonemes across speakers. So is there like something that's done to make sure that it is kind of cross-speaker?
As far as I know, it's all just dumped into the model. So the main training data set is the LibreSpeech data set, which is mostly L1 kind of retirees from the Midwest reading audiobooks. So it's not explicitly marketed as a multilingual model or a kind of multi-dialectal model, but there is natural variation from person to person. Ankita Prasad and Kwanghi Choi have done really interesting work looking at separating, or whether and how you can separate kind of phonetic acoustic information, kind of not quite phonological information, but a little bit more low-level acoustic information from speaker identity characteristics, like gender or age or perceived race or that kind of thing. And I think you can in a certain way, but I'm not that familiar with that work.
Okay.
Yeah. So the plan here is to, as I said before, we have these kind of pile of embeddings from a unfine-tuned audio contrastive model, the wave-to-vec model, and then a pile of embeddings from the word contrastive model. We're going to subject each of these set of representations to analysis, analogous to what we expose humans to do to understand the cognitive processes involved in word recognition. And by comparing across the two, we're going to try to isolate functional differences that the task demands of word recognition impose on the kind of unstructured representations that are the self-supervised model learns. We're going to have two test cases. I see I've been talking for about, okay, not that long, never mind. We're going till when?
12.
Oh, okay, so we'll be fine. We have two kind of test cases to go through, which are quite similar in format, but I think complementary in finding. One looking at English SZ, and one looking at English Great. So the last thing to put on the table before we get started is a little bit of information about kinds of linguistic representations. And I mean representations in a very non-fancy way, just like the kind of information that is conveyed by different parts of the signal. As I'll kind of put these on the board, as we go up, we're going to get increasing levels of abstraction. So at the bottom are things you can measure with a microphone, and the top things that are like, often the subject of philosophy, and things in the middle. So phonetics, you may have heard this term before. This is something you can measure with a microphone. The contribution of different kinds of phonetic variation are information about speakers with their context. So I could say the exact same sentence as Eric, but we might have two different shaped vocal tracks or be speaking in two different environments. Those are phonetic differences. The next level up is phonological. This is where we'll be spending a lot of our time today. This is invariant across speakers and contexts. So if I say the word bat, and Eric says the word bat, and Jay says the word bat, the acoustic details of our particular productions will vary, and certainly do vary from person to person and across time within person. But the content, the b-ness, the a-ness, and the t-ness are the phonological categories, the phonemes at this level. And they contribute, sound categories. Morphological information, this is the other big one that we'll be talking about today, is invariant to sound categories. So we'll be talking here about morphemes, which are kind of pieces of meaning, pieces of forms that bear meaning. I'll give you examples of this, don't worry. But they might kind of have different contextual variants with different sounds in them. Above this, we get kind of semantic representations. These are invariant to form meaning pairings. I could talk more about this if you'd like, but it's a little bit abstract for the current talk. But they contribute things like lexical and grammatical meaning. This is where we start to get meaning from speech. And there are, you can get higher, you can get lower if you want to. But this is kind of the phonology and morphology are where we'll be spending most of today's talk. Questions so far? Cool. Okay. So phenomenon the first. In English, there are a lot of things that you might recognize as Z or S endings onwards. There are actually two different kinds of functions. Well, there are more than two, but we're talking about two particular kinds of functions of these morphemes. There's the Z that means plural. So dogs, bags. And then there's the Z that inflects a verb for a third person singular. So go, goes, sing, sings, that kind of thing. They have the same set of allomorphs. This is where things get a little bit tricky. Allomorphs are contextual variants of morphemes. So let me break this down, hopefully with some clarity here. So the plural noun, the Z that does noun pluralization, can show up as a Z sound. That's one allomorph. That's the Z in slashes on words that have a voiced final sound, where your vocal cords are vibrating. So like daughter ends in a vowel and so you say daughters, not daughters, right? If you're thinking, I never thought of this before, like that's fine. That's because you speak this language and you don't have to worry about it. That's the good part. They're also the same kind of function done by this morpheme of pluralizing nouns can be kind of cashed out in phonological representations as an S. So these occur after voiceless sounds, cases where your vocal folds aren't vibrating. So lip, there's no vocal folduration here, and so you say lips rather than lips, right? There's also an is case you might be wondering about, like bush, bushes. You don't say bushs or bushes. In fact, it's hard to say. Those actually are token-wise very small, and we're going to be basically setting those aside for today. We have that data, but we're not going to be presenting that. So that's about noun pluralization. Verb inflection, third-person singulars, have the same cast of characters, it seems like. So there's the Z sound that goes on voicing final verbs, like bring, has a voiced final segment, engma. And so you say brings, not brings. And similarly, speak, which ends in a voiceless sound, gets you the voiceless sound. So crucially, the work of pluralizing a verb is the semantic work, and the morphological kind of thing that's doing that, we think cognitively, doesn't care about what the sounds are. It's just like, you're doing a thing that turns the verb into third person, or that pluralizes the noun. But you get kind of low-level contextual predictable variation here. There's a third category, which we'll be talking about, which are kind of the false friends of the bunch. There's these we're calling non-morphemic. These are word pairs that just coincidentally look like they obey the same kind of base inflected form as daughter, daughters, and lip, lips, and bring, brings. Even though and those they have the same kind of, one is the base and one is the exact same as the base plus a z, but they don't share the same kind of meaning overlap. And we'll also see they don't share the same kind of distributional kind of relationship that the inflected forms do. Similarly for S, there's words like sick and there's words like six. And if you were just looking just at how they sounded, you might infer that six was a third person singular verb, but that's not the case. It's just a coincidence about how the words in language are structured. Another way of putting, and to summarize this table, is that there are two allomorphs. Lies. There are two morphemes. We think they're the same kind of representation, although they're doing two different tasks. They have the same set of contextual variants, allomorphs, and those allomorphs are governed by the same principles. This was like a big chunk. How do we feel about this? Distressed, perplexed, excited?
It makes sense, I guess. Let's say my prediction would be that this would be very learnable by a wave to back kind of approach, because it's very consistent the way you presented it. So is there inconsistency in the sequences that would cause us to be like, oh, actually, this is up in the air? Is it really the non-morphemic category is the one where I'd say, oh, there's like something that's not actually,
Good.
Yeah.
So that's the right question to ask, and we'll get to that in like 2 slides.
Okay.
I just wanted to know, are we okay with these kind of concepts and relationships? Great. Okay.
Is the
But thank you for
non-morphemic
asking.
example are sort of chosen because there is no inflected form of those base words?
Yeah, there are kind of unambiguous cases where though is, it's I guess an adverb or whatever.
Is there like sick, you can like sick a dog on someone, like
Yes.
he's sick.
Yes.
That's like maybe not common enough. You're like looking at things like broader, like
No, I mean, sick is an ambiguous, it's an adjective or a verb.
Yeah.
I think we included those in, I have to ask John about this. We did filtering basically to make sure that we only got unambiguous nouns and that were not also verbs.
okay.
So for example, Google can be a noun or a verb, and we want to make sure we're not sort of, we're kind of picking verbs like bring that is, you can't say, look, a big bring,
Yeah.
right? That can't be a noun. And similarly for like lip.
Okay.
That's a fair question to ask about sick though.
That makes sense. You have information about roles or yeah.
Basically, we don't want to kind of have false inflation by taking advantage of the fact that English is this very flexible kind of noun-verb relationship. Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, so I talked about the way we were processing the data. Now, what is the data we're processing? We're processing the LibreSpeech data set. This is what the wave spec model was trained with. It's basically audiobook readings. I guess they do have British English, not just American English, so like that. We sourced 786 regular nouns and 61 regular verbs whose inflected forms were unambiguous, right? So belongs is only a verb and not a plural noun. Currents is only a plural noun and not a verb. Six, sick is not a inflected form of sick. Modulo the point that you just read. I think, in fact, it ended up in this category because although you can say, I sicked that dog on that person or whatever, there were no cases in the training data set that had that use of the verb.
Yeah.
As you can see, there's wildly imbalanced ones, right? It's hard to find these in general. There are lots more z final, or there are lots more forms that take z than take s, and the z's we're just going to drop.
There's no slang in your training corpus. It's like just like normal book readings or
only in as much as there's slang in like written text, which is to say like not that much, I don't think. Yeah, but
that sick means something else in slang, right? Like it's very good or something.
yeah. It does. In that case, that would be fine because sick is still being an adjective. It's an adjective that means something different. Means good, not ill. But ill can also mean good, right? So anyway, this is why linguistics is picky. But yeah, as far as I know, there's not kind of systematic, non-standard dialect for American English. Great. So once we have these words, we're going to kind of do a very coarse kind of first glance at what the relationship between the inflected and base form of these words looks like. So what I'm going to show you next is just the kind of PC1 and PC2 space of all of the words in the data set from the word contrastive model. And then what I'll show you next is arrows where one end is tokens of the uninflected form, so speak, and the other end is the relevant inflected form, so speaks. So you can see sort of there's seems to be consistent across both allomorphs and also parts of speech. This kind of global direction in the representational space that links the bases and their inflected forms. So we're going to be digging into this a bit more next. But kind of our base, this gives us reason to kind of, let me put this differently. What we're going to be spending the rest of the talk on is trying to understand what this relationship means, what is embedded in this direction, what it represents. But we're kind of starting from this discovery that there's a global direction that links bases and inflected forms. Notably, like across things like nouns and verbs, and seemingly insensitive to phonology, which is interesting.
I mean, I guess just looking at that, kind of have to squint a little to say, well, bring and speak are, they're kind of moving in the same direction as you would expect because they're very similar kind of sounds. So did you quantify in like the full vector space how big the difference is in both these models?
Like the norm of the difference between between angles or between
I mean, like
certain
basically
endpoints?
if you take the difference between all of the Z and S pairs and you say like this is what the kind of whatever the average difference is, and then you could say between the Z's and the S's, I can discriminate between them, or how discriminative is that kind of boundary, or like I'm kind of thinking it from that analytical perspective of like if I look, I can kind of see that the angles are a little different, but there are hundreds of these, right? Like, what is the regularity of this?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
We're not using that exact method, but we'll get to that question exactly in the next couple slides. I believe we have information on what like the norm of these differences are, but I don't have that to hand. Right. So what we're going to kind of do here is turn this into an analogy task. Basically, sorry, let me put this differently. You can predict that if there is this linear relation between, say, daughter and daughters, you might ask, okay, if I start from a different point in space, like lip, and move yay much in that same direction, how close am I to lips? So what we're going to try to, and the way we're going to evaluate this relationship is by how well you can kind of do this transformation or this transfer task. We're going to kind of first compute from the embeddings of daughter and daughters a difference vector, basically, that corresponds to like the difference, the magnitude and direction of the that relationship. And then we're going to ask, okay, if you then add that to another base point, like I just said, how close do you get to the true item? This imposes a ranking on the tokens in the data set. And we're going to kind of use a generalization of the ranking, which is kind of an average precision for hitting the right type. John can talk a little bit about how exactly we calculated this later, but this is going to be our kind of evaluation metric for the rest of the talk. Higher is better, lower is worse. And if we're doing this importantly across at the token level, so we're kind of sampling a random token of the word daughter, a random token of the word daughters, get that difference, see how well you can transfer it, do that again and again many times to evaluate what that systematic relationship is like. And then, of course, mapping that over word types, daughter and brother and father and whatever. All right, so we're going to ask what is encoded in this translation. Specifically, is it a morphological transformation? So is that relationship sensitive to kind of what function these or s is doing, whether it's pluralizing or inflecting? And also, is it a phonological transformation? So this is exactly what you asked, Jay. It's like, does it care about whether you're taking a s vector and putting it in a place where a z vector would be expected? And then finally, we're going to ask, okay, if we optimize for word recognition, how does these representations change? We're going to be comparing these two models with embeddings. So first off, we're going to ask, is this a morphological transformation? That is to say, we want to know if you go from a difference vector computed from nouns and stick that on a uninflected verb, how close do you get to the relevant inflected verb? I'm going to show you like this. This is a lot to look at, so let me talk you through it. On the vertical axis is average precision. A random baseline is about 0.01% on the vertical axis. So all of these are doing really well by that measure. The facets within the the x-axis represent where you're sourcing your vector difference vector from. Are you getting it from a noun like lip lips? Are you getting it from a verb like bring brings? Or are you getting it from a false friend like 6 or those? And then we're saying, okay, with that type of difference vector, how well do you do in attaching it to a noun base or a verb base or a false friend base? Are we okay with what we're seeing? And then I'll tell you, of course, trying to unpack what it might mean, but are we okay with the graph? Great.
So just what does the false friend setup look like? Because if you have 6 is to lip something, right? Like, as you said, there's no actual relationship between 6 and 6.
Well, the model doesn't know that. The model knows exactly what we hear, which is to say the relationship between 6 and 6 is that there's a sick part that they both share, and that has some distributional information.
Okay.
And then a sixth part, which has maybe different distributional information,
Okay.
but is phonologically similar to the sixth part. And then there's the S.
Okay.
So it is, in a sense, unfair, because the nouns and verbs share distributional information, semantic information that the model might know that 6, or those don't have. But we want to kind of know, if we didn't have that as a category, we wouldn't be able to tell whether the model was being sensitive to morphological structure or simply phonological overlap.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it taking into consideration any context at all?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how are the embeddings calculated?
So we force aligned the audio. And if you manually take a transcript, you force align it. And then you just take you call the span of acoustic chunks if within that word boundary, that word. And then I believe, Don, I would like to hear about this afterwards. I forget, I think we mean pooled over that. And that's our sort of vector for that token. Does that make sense? Apologize if I'm speaking down or speaking up to you. This is, like I said, interdisciplinary in the best sense of the word, in which no one is an expert on all of it. And so I'm trying to make sure that I'm conveying what I know and flagging what I don't. So what I want you to take away from this is that basically there's heterogeneity, right? If we saw an effect of, okay, whatever your source is, it only matters whether you attach it to the matching base or not. We would expect kind of verbs have a verb match advantage, false friends have a false friend match advantage, nouns have a nouns match advantage. We don't really see that. We see like nouns are kind of easier to transfer into across the board. Verbs are harder, except if you're a verb, and false friends are sort of in the middle. So this doesn't seem to obey a clear generalization about what the morphological source is doing or what the target is doing. We're going to then compare this to what we see when we apply this same test to the word model. These are representations from the fine-tuned for word representational model. And we see basically more structure. Overall, you get kind of increase in accuracy. And now what I'd like you to notice is that there's this distinction, the separation between the nouns and verbs that sort of seem to be better at acting as sources for each other and also as targets, and the false friends. So we'll talk what this means in a second, but this is sort of suggesting that there's information here that nouns and verbs share distributionally, that is usable and transferable across category, that isn't shared by the false friends. Importantly, the verb category match advantage disappears. So what we'd like to kind of suggest is that this model shows reduced sensitivity to morpheme identity distinctions, right? If you're a verb transferring to a verb or a noun to a noun, that's less sensitive. So you seem to kind of be able to transfer pretty well across in both cases. But there is this increased distinction, and we have stats to back this up, to the binary, are you morphologically complex or are you a false friend? We're next going to ask, we can visualize this difference a little bit better in the following way. We can compare the average precision for the wave-to-vec model and the word model. First, now collapsing by kind of whether you match categories, whether you're a noun to a noun or a verb to a verb, or whether you're mismatching categories, like a noun vector trying to transfer onto a verb or a false friend trying to transfer onto a noun. And we see that in the wave-to-vec model, this difference is quite large. You have the heterogeneity. It's actually largely driven by that verb effect we saw, but it's still kind of there marginally for the nouns. But when you optimize for word recognition, this falls to 0. We can also look at the complexity effect, whether you're a false friend or not, basically, whether you have any morphological structure or not. And this is, while present in the base model, exaggerated in the word model. I think this is I think a little cleaner way of showing this claim, that you lose within morphological category distinction in the word model, but gain a kind of noticeable bump for being morphologically complex or not. We'll next ask, is this a phonological transformation? So we've so far been blithely la 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 laing our way past whether it's a z or a s. Now we'll dive into that a little more. So I'm going to show you these heat maps where we can say, okay, if there's a cell that has some accuracy in it, that is about transferring from a verb in S, like exists, and seeing whether that transfers to a noun in, I believe, S, nets, or whether you get a verb in Z, like shine, shines, and transferring to a noun, nets. What I'd like to show you, what I'd like you to take away from this here is that there isn't a lot of a kind of match structure. It's there if you really squint, but the major structure on this matrix is just this like block, right? You get verbs transferring well, verbs into verbs doing well, verbs into, nouns into verbs doing poorly, verbs into nouns doing okay, and nouns into nouns doing okay. So the base model doesn't seem like there's a lot of information about the phonological structure, which is maybe contrary to what we might expect, given that it's latent in the signal. When we look at the word contrastive model, first off, we see in general it performs better, which is what we saw before. And there's still, so we kind of null out this major block structure in a way, but there's still not a lot of phonological structure here, which is interesting, right? Like the model's not picking up on either in its base or fine-tuned state this like really predictable, obvious, reliable generalization about where S and Z are distributed. So we're going to say it suppresses phonological distinctions, or maybe lacks phonological distinctions, while improving accuracy. Okay, let's go a little faster just to kind of make sure we get through everything. There are to summarize S and Z, we have two morphemes. They have the same allomorphs. They have the same phonological conditions on their distribution, right? What we found is that the word model enhances this binary morphological complexity effect, while it suppresses specific morphological category information. And it also suppresses phonological differences. So it seems like only certain things are relevant for word recognition. And we'll get back to why these are maintained and the others in a second. We'll talk about next. This is going to have basically the exact same analytical structure as what we've just talked about, but with different moving parts. And so I'll step a little bit faster through this to make sure we get through everything. The sound in question is English it's a word final that's what this in IPA, it's International Phonetic Alphabet. Everyone should know it. It's great. There's one sound for one symbol, and this little squiggly symbol is there are kind of, as with S and Z, there are multiple sources for what that could be doing when you hear an in speech. There's the comparative form. So some mean taller, mean more blank. So you have tall, taller, prettier. There are other that are adjunctive. So this is someone who X's. It's run, runner, wrestle, wrestler, complement, complementer. And then, as before, there are some kind of coincidences in lexicon that are non-morphemic. Wisp is a word, and whisper is a word, but whisper doesn't mean you're more wisp, or someone who wisps. That's just not what the meaning is. So they, again, share the form overlap, but not the distributional overlap. What I'd like to kind of flag here is that, unlike with S and Z, the places where shows up in each of these different morphemes are quite restricted. So comparative has a much more narrow distribution than adjunctive So for example, what we're talking about here is you basically can't have comparative that are 3 syllables or more. So you can say this is more dangerous than that, but you can't say this is dangerouser than that. Same with like intelligenter. It just doesn't work. You don't see it in the data. You basically only get comparatives on 2 syllables and 1 syllable words. The rest of the time you use more. Whereas with adjectives, you can have, as long as you like. Marathon runner is one thing with an on it. The corpus is the same corpus as before. We're comparing these 3 unambiguous categories. Again, there are some overlaps that you might think of where one could mean 2 things, where taking those out. The counts overall are quite a bit lower, but they're a little bit kind of flatter across categories. We can first do the kind of linear geometry sniff test. Things look approximately similar, but now we're actually in PC3 and PC4. PC 1 and 2 don't show the structure. So what this is telling us is it's a little subtler of a generalization of a relationship. We can now ask, is the relationship between ride and rider and wisp and whisper and tall and taller, what's encoded in that direction? Is it a morphological relationship? Is it sensitive to whether the is an adjunctive or a comparative or a false friend This is what's in the unfine-tuned model. And here the story is largely similar to what you find in qualitative sense to what you find with pluralization. You get kind of heterogeneity. So it seems like if you have a vector, a difference vector from tall, taller, and you stick that on big, you get really good at transferring to bigger. But not so if you're getting that from run, runner, and transferring to whisper. So there's heterogeneity across the board. What I'd like you to notice is there's this kind of hint of a category match effect where adjectives are a little bit better at acting as their own source, but comparatives are a lot better. And what we see in the word model is two things. First off, everything gets better, which is maybe a good sign. And now this kind of category match effect is exaggerated. We're kind of picking up on and boosting the fact that this is not just any old but specifically an adjunctive that's retained as useful information in the word model. We can kind of, so what we'll say is that the word model increases sensitivity to morphological distinctions. And what's harder to see in this graph, but I'll show you on the next one, is that it also increases sensitivity to binary morphological complexity. Are you a false friend or not? Is that kind of a real morpheme or not? This is showing the same kind of difference. So first, we're looking at the category match effect. So do you do better transferring from from a adjunctive to an adjunctive, or a comparative to a comparative? That effect is present in the base model, but exaggerated in the fine-tuned model. And we see the same thing for the kind of binary category of, are you morphologically complex at all? That's picked up on and exaggerated in the word model. We're going a little bit faster for this, but I want to make sure everyone's still on board. Are we major questions, major confusions, distress? No. We're almost done. So to summarize this is going to be a similar story. There are two morphemes. They both sound the same. They're both They do two different things. One makes comparatives, one makes adjectives. They only have one form they ever show up in, unlike with SZ, where they kind of have this predictable variation. There are different phonological conditions on their distribution, though. You only ever find comparative on short words, basically. So this is a phonological condition on their distribution, even though there's only one shape. It's sort of one has a very restricted habitat, and the other one has a broader habitat. So it's a distributional difference, but one that is kind of parameterized in terms that care about sound things. So how many syllables the base has that you attach to. And what we saw is that the word model enhances kind of binary complexity effects, right? You get from taller and runner doing better within themselves than towards whisper. And then you also get this morphology level match effect. So to start to summarize, we've presented two cases of homophonous morphemes with different outcomes, right? The distributional differences that are functionally important for word recognition, we think drive this kind of enhancement of abstract morphological structure. So salient distributional differences, in the case of this kind of the syllable count effect, support the maintenance of this distinction between two surface identical kind of categories, whereas there's no kind of that, although it's fully predictable, it's also fully not useful in determining which morpheme you're working with, whether Z or S shows up. And so that distinction is collapsed for the kind of the SC in the word model. So we can kind of sort of say that the buck stops at different places. You retain only information in as far as it's distributionally kind of useful, not just if it's present, kind of to enforce abstract differences. So there's no kind of abstract difference between the S and the Z, sorry, the Z plural and the Z third person singular, while there is one for the two verbs. What we also find is that the regular relations that obtain between morphologically complex words and their parts. So this is the fact that break and breaks, the two bases mean the same thing. Those correlate to similarities in their distribution in the data in a way that though and those, or wisp and whisper, don't have similar distributions in the data. You could think of this as kind of a distributional correlate of semantics. The fact that they share this similarity is picked up on and exaggerated by the word recognition model. We think this means that kind of functional pressures to efficiently and incrementally recognize words drive retention and exaggeration of relevant linguistic structure and erases irrelevant details like the SZ difference. This suggests kind of in the bigger picture, it's like thinking towards neuroscience, that the optimal code kind of representationally in these distributed systems for word recognition relies on abstract linguistic structure. And it's also context dependent, right? Like what gets retained is a function of, is a function of its utility. So I think we should, for modelers, for people interested in kind of understanding what these systems are doing, it's less useful in a way to ask, what representations do speech models use, right? This is an unconstrained task. It's kind of, it's the question you want to know, but it doesn't seem to have a clear answer. And we actually get quite a bit of kind of mileage out of asking, okay, when you condition on a specific task, what information is retained, what distinctions are enhanced, and what distinctions are collapsed as a function of that task. So this gives us a kind of insight into the relationship between functional pressures and the representations that underpin that task. Just to summarize, I've shown that they're kind of the way that speech models do word recognition tracks phonological and morphological information in regular English morphology using a kind of very simple geometric relationship. The emergence of this structure is related to its distributional salience and also its utility in organizing the lexicon, not simply whether there is any variance that is predictable in the data. And this kind of has a broader implication that computational evidence that gives us computational evidence that task pressures shape task relevant representations, not only whether or not you see a task effect in an experimental paradigm, but actually the representations underlying this are different potentially for these two different kinds of tasks, depending on what you're doing. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
If there's any questions from people online, they can put them in the chat and I'll try and read them out. Otherwise, if there's questions from people in the room.
Yeah, I had a question whether anyone's done this human experiment, right? Like you could isolate from these recordings the morpheme or like the actual wave, 20 millisecond wave segment and say, did this come from a pluralization of a noun or a verb, or did this come from a comparative or subjunctive?
Yeah.
Like, are humans able to discriminate, and is there, and I guess like how much of that, you said basically the contrast between these two phenomena was this, semantic meaning, and so how much of that is kind of carries over into our practical speech recognition as humans?
Right. I think in isolation, basically people aren't sensitive to it.
There's what?
People basically aren't sensitive to it. There have been some studies looking at like non-model based studies looking at things like, are there differences in duration or differences in subtle phonetic cues for the S that's in 6 versus in legs, or sorry, that's not example, lips. And different studies find different results. The effect sizes are tiny and actually experimentally tested below the just noticeable difference threshold for most humans. So this doesn't seem to be actually driving, this doesn't seem to be a bottom-up signal for humans, at least, that people use. So the fact that we find these differences in production is usually taken to be a effect of top-down like cascading activation during speech production that lead to like subtle phonetic differences in production rather than being something that you're like learning and doing on purpose. Does that answer that question?
I think so. I mean, I guess what I took away from that is that we do it, but we don't like recognize it.
Yeah. Yeah. If it's done, it's not used perceptually by people.
Well, I guess, maybe to dig into that, it must be done if you're seeing this categorical preference, because there must be something that is really all you have is the audio, right? Mm-hmm. So the fact that there is some preference suggests that there is some difference, right?
Well, we have the audio plus all of the information contained in the context of the audio. Mm-hmm. So it's not just, here's this snippet of the from lips, but it's actually that, that little chunk taken in its whole context. So it gets enriched by information from the convolutional blocks, you get downsampling, and then you get, of course, cross attention in the transformer layers. So it is actually enriched with something much more than just what you hear. I don't know if we actually have data on this, but for a different project that uses similar kinds of methods, we have an analysis that's just run on the raw waveforms and trying to do the same kind of thing. Like if you just take, if your representations are just like the acoustic measurements, and you don't get nearly as good performance as the model or the model-based representations.
Well, just so the context, does it extend past the word boundary?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. The utterances are passed in as kind of whole utterances, and then the representations are kind of resected out, so to speak, according to their word boundaries in the input. Yeah.
I don't see any other questions, so I think, yeah, we can end on time. And if people have other questions, they can reach out to Canaan,
yeah,
in person or line.
Let me check my phone to see if there's anything John wants to add. He's in the room as an observer, but not as a speaker. No, Ruby. So on that note, thank you all again for having me. This has been really.
Thank you.